This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and CuriosityStream. Stay tuned at the end of the video for more on how to get a discounted subscription. This one is getting demonetized after all, because YouTube devalues history education. They even age-restricted the preview version, because apparently Team YouTube doesn't want high schoolers to learn about the Holocaust. In a previous video, they blatantly said that content about the Holodomor was not educational, and now they are explicitly claiming that teaching about the Holocaust is non-educational, meaning kids younger than 18, which includes high schoolers, should not learn about it. So Team YouTube is complicit in genocide denial. Let that sink in. Makes sense, since bigotry is a good chunk of their revenue source. Gotta keep them bigots on the platform or they might not watch as many commercials. This is beyond sickening. Plus, it's not like they are even consistent either. I had one version get approved, another that wasn't flagged at all, and two demonetized by manual review. Two that were literally the exact same upload with completely different outcomes. They're likely to sneak demonetize anything that gets through, as they have done with a number of my videos. So be sure to stick after the episode to promote a platform that actually tries to educate people about the Holocaust, unlike Team YouTube, who denies it. So on with the show. Hey, Cypher here. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, so I think it's finally time to review Schindler's List. It's honestly one of the best movies I've reviewed on this channel. The only significant issue is with omissions, which I don't really find much of a problem. This is actually part of a big collaboration between history channels about the Holocaust, or Shoah as it's known in Hebrew. So be sure to hop on the playlist if you haven't already. Also, before we get started, even though the Nazis targeted many groups, this is only focusing on the Jewish side of the Holocaust, who make up more than half the 11 million people killed during it. The genocide also attacked leftists, Roma, Soviet civilians and POWs for being Slavs, open homosexuals, mentally and physically disabled people, and even Jehovah's Witnesses. Each has their own unique story, but today I'm looking at the Jewish part of the Holocaust, or Shoah. But before we go into this cataclysm, let's take a sanity break and look at some footage of my cat, King Richard I, also known as the Lionheart. Get it? Yes, he's an adorable little guy, but his namesake was actually quite an anti-Semite, who was partially responsible for a pogrom during his reign. I named him for the pun, but unfortunately the real guy had his problems, despite being the origination of the English royal flag. Sorry, but we've got to talk about how that kind of thing led to the Shoah. Anti-Semitism was prevalent throughout the Western world for centuries. Ancient Rome scattered the Jewish people after their rebellions during the 1st century AD, and their population remained in diaspora. As such, throughout the Middle Ages, Jews were easily discriminated against for being a non-Christian population amongst Christians. Catholicism opposed usury and therefore banking, allowing for outsiders like Jews to take over those duties. It gave yet another impetus of centuries of anti-Semitism to work their way into the culture of Europeans, for it benefited them to discriminate against Jews. People came up with elaborate and libelous myths they used to justify this bigotry. Throughout the 19th century, new ways of alienating the Jewish population arose. Scientific racists defined them as a separate race. At the same time, these scientists advocated for racial purity and various means of maintaining it. They argued that undesirables had to be eliminated from the gene pool. This was called eugenics. Most simply asked for sterilization or isolation, but some went so far as to advocate euthanasia. On top of all that, the blood libels of old became mixed with newer conspiracism, seeing elaborate Jewish conspiracies behind political progress. Anything like civil rights, socialism, and rich Jews was a threat to white supremacy. This was everywhere, not just Germany. But after World War I, many blamed the loss of the war on a Jewish conspiracy, including a young Adolf Hitler. In his long screed called Mein Kampf, he said,
"The whole of war production was under Jewish control, while the Jew robbed the whole nation and pressed it beneath his domination, and agitation was carried on against the Prussians. Sailors arrived in trucks and proclaimed the revolution. A few Jewish youths were the leaders in this struggle. They raised the red flag in the homeland. In these nights, hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. The Kaiser held out a conciliatory hand to the leaders of Marxism, without suspecting that the scoundrels have no honor. While they still held the imperial hand in theirs, their other hand was reaching for the dagger. There is no making pacts with Jews. They can only be the hard either-or. I, for my part, decided to go into politics."
This was the stab-in-the-back myth, the foundational conspiracy theory of Nazism. According to them, the Weimar Republic was spontaneously started by Jews to disrupt the German war effort, and Hitler decided to seek vengeance through politics. It was a conspiracy theory, and much like that form of bigotry, it led to one of the worst tragedies in history. Hitler rose to be leader of his party of right-wing ultranationalists called the National Socialist Party, or simply Nazis. The Socialist Party is a bit of a misnomer, adopted purely to appeal to a larger swath of Germany. Hitler actually thought socialism was a Jewish conspiracy, but there were socialist elements in the Nazi Party. Contrary to loony misconceptions, Nazis were not leftists in any conception of the term. While Nazis failed to gain a majority in the Weimar Republic, and Hitler was never elected president, they became the plurality in the Reichstag as of 1932. President Hindenburg appointed Nazis, including Hitler, to key positions in January of 1933. Hindenburg wanted Hitler to revive the greatness of Germany, just as he'd been promising for a decade. Lo and behold, the Reichstag itself burned only a month later, and Hitler blamed Jewish communists, most of whom were actually not Jewish. But that didn't stop him. So they passed a series of enabling acts, making him fascist leader of Germany, or simply Führer, with virtually unlimited dictatorial power. The Nazis immediately set about creating policies detrimental to their sworn enemies by stopping non-Aryans from working in government, limiting Jewish businesses' size, and even boycotting them for a day. Soon, Hitler had the socialist elements of his party purged during the Night of Long Knives. This inaugurated the first concentration camp in Dachau, where Nazis sent their political prisoners, many of whom were Jewish. On the entry gate read the now famous words, "Arbeit macht frei," or "Work sets you free." Only a year later, during the annual Nazi rally in Nuremberg, they passed a series of laws which declared Jews were not citizens of the Reich and could not marry or have sex with Germans. In one fell swoop, Germans were largely segregated. From then on, they imposed further and further restrictions on Jews, finding new ways of excluding them. As these laws worsened, especially with the expulsion of Polish Jews and German Jews fleeing for refuge elsewhere, the world began to take notice. So one of those seeking refuge assassinated a German minister in Paris on the 9th of November, 1938. This ignited an anti-Jewish pogrom throughout Germany, destroying thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues, killing over 90 Jews, and arresting around 30,000. It is known as the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht in German, because of all the destruction. This allowed the Nazis to implement full apartheid of Jews and force them to wear the Star of David to denote their exclusion. Jews immigrated in droves to escape the horror. Many who couldn't chose suicide. When Germany invaded Poland, this took on a whole new dimension. Suddenly, Nazis were in control of 3.5 million more Jews. They ordered all Jews under their jurisdiction into 4 ghettos and confiscated their properties, a reminder of how Jews were treated only a couple centuries prior. They lived under horrible conditions of mass starvation and disease. These ghettos were self-organized, with formerly wealthy Jews collaborating as best they could, so that their SS overlords had no reason to execute more of them for insubordination. Germany enslaved millions to work them to death. To hunt down anyone who'd escaped, the SS organized death squads called Einsatzgruppen. When they invaded the Soviet Union a couple years later, these murderers were used to hunt Jews and massacre civilians in further territories. With so many Jews to control, including those in France and the Balkans, the Nazis needed to figure out what to do with them. Throughout 1941, they started massacring people, simply to make space. But Nazis realized mass shootings were far too inefficient for what they needed to do. The ghettos were liquidated, either killing anyone who was hiding and refused to go, or sending them to concentration camps. Warsaw resisted in a futile last stand, knowing they had nothing to lose. With all those who survived rounded up into concentration camps, the SS agreed upon a final solution to turn the massacres to an industrial scale. The final solution started with simple vans that fed the exhaust into airtight compartments as they drove their cargo to death. They then created extermination camps, where they used carbon dioxide to suffocate millions on an industrial scale, even inventing faster ways to burn the bodies. The camps were essentially nothing but long lines to die, and the SS had to pay for it with slave labor in factories or through whatever money they could make off the killings. Jewish slaves called Sonderkommandos stripped the corpses of all goods, such as gold fillings and even hair to insulate U-boats. The second extension of Auschwitz took further advances in this genocide, using Zyklon B to quicken the killing. Germany was fighting a losing war, though. As the Allies pushed the Axis powers back, the Nazis started trying to hide the evidence by destroying the killing machinery and burying the dead they couldn't burn quick enough. They managed to cover up enough to allow generations of bigots to deny what had happened, thereby reinforcing the conspiracism that caused so much death in the first place. The Soviets first liberated concentration camps, but not before some were completely dismantled, like the most effective one near Treblinka. Eventually, the Allies liberated all the camps. As Jews returned, many faced discrimination and pogroms from wherever they were turning to, and they had to seek refuge elsewhere, sparking off troubles in the British Mandate of Palestine that would lead to the creation of Israel. During all of that, many trials made a long process of trying to find some semblance of retributive justice at Nuremberg. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews and around 5 million others. Almost 90% of Poland's Jewish population died. The way it went from simple segregation to industrial extermination remains a warning to us all. For those who survived, many found solace in the story of one Nazi turned savior. Before we go into Schindler's story, we need another sanity break, so here's some more imagery of my cat. Hey King, you want Saladin? You want Saladin? You want Saladin? You want Saladin? Here's Saladin. Here's Saladin. Alright, back to the Nazi who became a hero to many Jews. Oskar Schindler grew up in Czechoslovakia as a Sudeten German. As such, he had sympathies with the Nazis' promise of unifying the Germans under one fascist nation. In 1935, he joined a pro-Nazi party and eventually became a spy for the Nazis' Abwehr themselves. He helped facilitate their annexing of the Sudetenland. He even spied on Poland before the German invasion in 1939. Schindler went to Krakow with his wife to live off the spoils of war by taking a factory. When he saw the ghettoization of Jews, he started to help them in minor ways. He made contacts with the black market to move goods through the ghetto, and hired a Jewish accountant named Itzhak Stern to find ways to hire more Jews for his enamelware company. Schindler was jailed on 3 separate occasions for minor offenses against the Nuremberg laws, since he was too kind to his slaves. His wife often helped his workers in secret, while he plied SS goons with bribes. Once the ghetto was liquidated and his workers sent to Plaszow concentration camp, he hired more Jews and protected them from the sadistic commandant there through copious bribery. Eventually, the camp had to remove into Czechoslovakia because the Red Army was approaching. Schindler managed to send 1,200 Jews there for weapons manufacturing. A group of women accidentally got redirected to Auschwitz for a few weeks, but were somehow negotiated back. Schindler kept the SS guards well-bribed and complacent. He managed to get another 200 Hungarian Jews in his factory before the end of the war. In trying to flee from charges of war crimes, he ended up in Argentina, along with his wife and some surviving Jews he had helped, known as Schindlerjude. Despite making a fortune from war profiteering, the bribery sent him into bankruptcy. He tried farming but failed at that, then returned to Germany, leaving his wife behind, and she'd never see him again. And then, of course, proceeded to fail at a number of other ventures. From 1963 onward, he depended on the gratitude of Schindlerjuden to keep him solvent, despite his constant carousing and drunkenness, especially when he continued doing so after a heart attack. He died in 1974, becoming the only Nazi to be granted the honor of being buried on Mount Zion among the other heroes of Israel. This is by far the most studied genocide in history. The literature is so thick, it'd be difficult to say what the main arguments are in the field. Most of it revolves around recovering voices of those who were silenced, especially as we lose that generation's collective memory without having interviewed all the survivors. Otherwise, the story is so thoroughly well-worn that historians are often turning to studying the cultural reproduction of the Holocaust rather than the event itself. And this movie really kicked off that trend. Schindler's List was kind of the first show or movie to graphically depict the horrors and still reach a wide audience. Previous ones, like Sophie's Choice, Exodus, or Judgment in Nuremberg, safely avoided the gruesome depiction by dealing with the aftermath. Others, like Hannah's War, simply did not have popular appeal. Schindler's List came at a perfect time in 1993 when the subject had matured enough for people to deal with the horror of the event without hurting the box office possibilities. Earlier that year, the Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in DC, sparking off a wave of Holocaust museums throughout the country. With the now iconic phrase "never again," public history on the topic has burgeoned enough to be its own industry. Currently, there are almost 300 members of the Association of Holocaust Organizations worldwide, and there are 6 major museums in the US, along with public memorials in every state. Few other genocides received this much attention, but that landscape was just the beginning in 1993. With such a concerted effort to remember this genocide, of course there are denialists. The Casual Historian made a documentary a while ago about how these people try to appropriate legitimacy to perpetuate that hateful disposition. There is no arguing with conspiracists, no matter how reasonable they attempt to appear. Atrocity denial is the worst form of bigotry and results in immediate banning from this channel. Remember, by decree of His Majesty King Richard I, bigots get banned. These people make the necessity of all this public history quite clear. So the movie had a lot to build off of just in scholarship. Of course, the story of Schindler was already well studied too, with many of the Schindlerjuden and his wife writing their own memoirs. Steven Spielberg, the director, took on the project that had actually been sitting in stasis since Schindler himself sold the rights to his story back in 1963. Spielberg had a very skeptical public to deal with. He directed blockbusters like Jaws, Indiana Jones, E.T., and the year before, Jurassic Park. So a lot of people thought he couldn't lend the necessary gravitas to this project. They were wrong. Even though the story was based on a historic fiction novel called Schindler's Ark, Spielberg devoted much of production into getting this correct, and he did a magnificent job of it. There is basically nothing in this movie that is verifiably false. It nails the necessities of historical storytelling by narrowing its subject to just the period of 1939 to 45, leaving plenty of room for fiction, and manages to maintain some ambiguity with a truly difficult topic. Like, you really get a sense of the progression of the Holocaust in Poland. The creeping move toward a final solution, why people would collaborate, and how Schindler managed to save the Schindlerjuden.
Every day that goes by, I'm losing money. Every worker that is shot costs me money. I have to find somebody else. I have to train them.
We're going to be making so much money that none of this is going to matter.
It's bad business.
Some have complained that Spielberg either focuses too much on the horror to the point of spectacle, or that the story is about survivors where so many people died. Notably, despite the heaps of criticism from people who were clearly trying to find the family-friendly side of Spielberg in a Holocaust movie, none of them are about inaccuracy, which to me effectively eliminates their validity. Not to mention the fact that these criticisms effectively cancel each other out through contradiction. This is a real story, exactly what one should expect from a based-on-a-true-story movie with the title Schindler's List. The fact that Spielberg chose a documentary-like color palette lends to its feeling of veracity. When he lets a little color slip in, it's actually to enhance that feeling of accuracy. The scene with the red-coated little girl is directly from Schindler's own recounting. Also, this final scene in color, where the actors are with their real-life counterparts or relatives thereof, is just a beautiful way of wrapping it up. On the characterization of Schindler as a carousing war profiteer, that's spot on too. With so much done well, it'd be far easier to talk about the inaccuracy of this film instead, for there is so little. Oskar Schindler goes through a bit of a transformation from Nazi to savior, but in reality he started saving Jews as early as possible. So when it shows him angry here...
Did you happen to notice that man had one arm?
Did he?
What's his use?
Very useful.
That's inaccurate, because in fact he was already working to save Jews. But this is a minor problem. The person who really gets short shrift is Emilie Schindler. She's depicted as being somewhat distant from her husband's illicit ventures to save Jews.
This is my wife, Stern. I don't keep any secrets from my spouse.
Oskar, please, attend to business. It's much more attractive.
But she was very involved. She worked tirelessly to keep them in good health at great risk to herself. There's one scene that's debatable according to Emilie's account. The movie shows Schindler saving the women who were accidentally shipped to Auschwitz, but Emilie said that they sent a beautiful secretary to use her feminine charm to gain the women back. Finally, the movie fictionalized the final speech, and this finale leads us to omissions. While I certainly don't begrudge the film for its omissions, some of them can be a bit misleading. Here at the end, we see a real thing happen where they make a ring out of a man's gold tooth fillings for Schindler, but what we don't see is Schindler eventually callously selling it years later. Also, Schindler was arrested 3 times for his violations of the Nuremberg laws regarding Jews. We only see it once. You see, these omissions reveal that Schindler didn't really change. He remained the same kind of philandering and irascible scoundrel he began as. So this story of character growth is misleading, but necessary. Another thing Spielberg simply couldn't include was the larger story of the Holocaust. From its origin to what returning survivors faced, these things couldn't be shown. Hopefully the reality section of this video helps fix that issue, but because of this omission, it can leave a very harmful impression. See, for the longest time, historians generally thought the Nazis planned the Holocaust from before their rise to power, and this was their intent all along. It is often how we think of Nazis today, but that is simply incorrect and can debase the very slogan of so many Holocaust memorials. Never again. The problem is, this idea that they wanted to create an industrial genocide to begin with is simply not backed up by primary sources. The final solution was only agreed to in 1941, almost a decade after the Nazis came to power. Instead, it is best to understand the Holocaust as something that evolved over time, that there was a seed of hatred that spurred on worse and worse measures, and that the necessities of war brought them further and further to the ultimate conclusion. If we don't recognize that, then people who are hateful can come to power again, proclaiming they are not genocidal, and then as things worsen, we might repeat these steps. Trying to understand why Nazis were so bigoted is a difficult thing. We need to get beyond good and evil and recognize that we are all capable of this horror. That's a painful realization. So many people refuse it and make cartoon villains instead of the much more truthful implication that all of Germany was complicit. For instance, did you know that the Wehrmacht unit with the most education was the Einsatzgruppen? The literal murder squads were filled with Germany's intellectual elite. Or how about the fact that most Western countries had massive eugenics programs that the Nazis based their movement off of? No, the Holocaust came via a twisted road, with very real people pushing the hate further and further. To the movie's credit, it does show an inkling of this. It mentions how Nazis thought communism was a Jewish conspiracy.
I'm an educated Jew, like Karl Marx himself. Shoot her.
But you can get the wrong impression. Like, all of this wanton cruelty was very real, but not seeing the steady change throughout the 1930s, before the German invasion of Poland, can make them seem like just caricatures. It's deeply uncomfortable to recognize what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, but it is a very real necessity of understanding what happened. That's why I heavily encourage y'all to check my sources for some good resources for digging deeper. I think the greatest thing about Schindler's List is that it serves as a good introduction to the Holocaust. But don't let that be the end. Grasping how hate builds to genocide is vital to make sure this never happens again. I'm pretty sure this one's getting demonetized because, of course, YouTube would discourage history tubers from publishing materials about difficult history like this. They don't have the backbone. Luckily, CuriosityStream does. And I'd like to thank them for sponsoring this video. They are a documentary streaming service with thousands of titles to go through. You can use it on any device like your TV, phone, and computer. They don't only cover history, but a whole plethora of topics, from science and nature documentaries to stuff like economics and philosophy. With 35 curated collections, they'll get you on your way to discover more. I recommend checking out Inside Hitler's Killing Machine. It goes into depth about the architecture of the concentration camps and how the historiography of them developed. That way you can dig deeper into this topic, which is exactly what I hope you will do. So if you click on the link below and use code CynicalHistorian, you'll get a discount on a year's subscription. It only costs $15 for the entire year, and you get unlimited access to all of their documentaries. So go check them out, and thanks to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this episode. Also, don't forget to check out that Shoah collaboration playlist, which is for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I'll see you guys next time.